Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Claw, a Canadian thriller, by Katie Berry, narrated by Alex Knox. Chapter 1. The towering bonfire crackled in the center of the large clearing, the fresh-cut firewood drying out as it burned. Huge plumes of smoke billowed into the cold night air, blending with the thick fog that surrounded the camp, adding to the limited visibility. Every once in a while, a new pocket of resin in the unseasoned wood would explode, shooting out yet another red-hot ember, seemingly in search of the first flammable thing it could find. Jerry Benson noted with frustration that he still seemed to be one of those flammable things, and scooted his camp chair back from the blazing fire another meter. He cursed under his breath and brushed the remains of the latest smoldering red fleck from his neon blue parka, not wanting it to burn through the fabric and ruin his new winter wear. "Hey, Jer, you look low." "Incoming," Tyler said, lobbing another beer. Jerry snapped out of fire suppression mode and deftly caught the canned beer in one hand. He placed it in the snow beside his chair, next to the other beer he'd barely touched. "Gotta keep up, bro. This booze isn't going to drink itself." Tyler took a large gulp from the huge bottle of bourbon he held. He placed it into the snow next to his chair and picked up a fresh can of beer that had been chilling in the snow. Cracking it open, he washed the burning remnants of whiskey down his throat in a long, thirsty swallow. After a belch loud enough to shake the snow from the overburdened trees around them, Tyler smiled contentedly, closed his eyes for a moment, then took another small sip of beer, savoring his barley beverage. Jerry shook his head slightly in disbelief, saying, "Thanks, Ty, but I think I'm okay for now. I'm not in the mood tonight." Tyler's eyes popped back open, and he leaned drunkenly toward Jerry, almost falling out of his chair in the process. A look of incredulity crossed his face, and he said, "Not in the mood? We're out here in the great Canadian outdoors, bombing around on our sleds, enjoying nature, and getting drunk. How in the hell can you not be in the mood?" Jerry yawned. "Just tired, I guess. It was a long drive." Tyler belched loudly at this news, then settled back into his chair once more. When Jerry had learned that his college brothers were heading out on a snowmobiling expedition into the Kootenay region of BC for their yearly vacation, he'd been all over it and jumped at the chance to join them. But his excitement this year wasn't because he still enjoyed coming along on these annual booze fests with the boys. No, it was for a different reason this year. After a decade and a half, he was tired of coming home from a week of drunken debauchery and feeling like Ray Milland from the Lost Weekend for several days afterward. This year was supposed to have been the year he told the guys he was done with the party animal thing. But it seemed as if fate was egging him along on this particular frat brother vacation in spite of his reservations. The real reason he'd been excited this year was the fact that their destination just happened to be near the site of a recent seismic event in the interior. And this event was in a region with a rich history of gold strikes, making it an opportunity too good for him to pass up. As a professor of geology at the University of British Columbia, Jerry Benson had been studying the Cascade Mountain Range for over a decade. The amount of gold mined from the area in the late 19th century and into the early 20th had been phenomenal. As a geologist, Jerry also knew there was still much more just waiting to be discovered in the region. Thanks to a significant earth tremor that occurred in the Cascadia subduction zone just after the new year, he hoped that it might have exposed some potential new sites in which to hunt for the valuable yellow metal. Earlier that afternoon, with camp set up, GPS unit in hand, and a few other tools of the trade thrown into his backpack, Jerry had set out looking for the fault line at the epicenter of the recent earthquake on his rented snowmobile. The machine was equipped with an eye-poppingly bright paint job that seared the eyeballs on contact. He dubbed it the Wasp-mobile as soon as he'd laid eyes upon it, thanks to its neon yellow and black color scheme along with its high-pitched, droning engine. Just looking at the damned thing made his temples throb. Departing much later than he'd wanted, Jerry knew he was operating under a time constraint. The hours of daylight left to explore were precious few, but he praised serendipity once more when, only 5.5 kilometers along, at the base of the Kootenai Glacier, he discovered the opening to a promising cavern in the cliffside. According to his GPS, it was centered almost directly over the new, quake-causing fault line. Gold Ridge was usually spared much of the fog and low cloud that had been socking in the city of Lawless and the valley below for the last few weeks. Up until now, Jerry had enjoyed a beautifully clear afternoon as he'd searched for the source of the fault, but his delightful day came with a bit of a caveat. Despite being located high above the valley cloud, quite often in late winter, just as the sun set behind the local mountains, rapidly dropping temperatures created a freezing ice fog. It crept down off the Kootenai Glacier, a pellucid presence that coated everything it touched in a slippery, crystalline crust. Any attempts at travel were a very difficult and dangerous time. The last thing Jerry wanted was to be caught off guard by the freezing frost. He knew he needed to leave enough time to get back safely to camp to avoid this hazard. Tumbling out of the cavern's entrance was what appeared to be a geothermal aquifer. Jerry knew there were already several hot springs located around Lawless, making it a popular destination for people looking to soak away their aches and pains. This new hot spring would add to the province of BC's already impressive total, which boasted 18 out of the 21 confirmed to be in Canada. Kneeling, Jerry measured the aquifer's temperature. At just a hair under 100 degrees Celsius, it was an excellent example of the province's true volcanic nature. It was far too hot for human use, and anyone unfortunate enough, or stupid enough, to try using this hot spring for skinny dipping would find their skin sloughing off like a blanched tomato before canning. Definitely a look but don't touch situation. He took one last quick look into the aquifer before entering the cavern and froze in his tracks. Glinting enticingly in the middle of the boiling stream was several of the largest-looking gold nuggets he'd ever seen, some of them easily the size of golf balls. He grabbed a broken branch from the base of a nearby tree and fished a few of the nuggets out, examining them once they'd cooled enough. As a geologist, without even having to break the ore open, Jerry Benson knew that what he held in his hands wasn't pyrite, but real gold. The rounded edges and corners of the nuggets in his hands were the telltale sign of authenticity, as they had none of pyrite's harder, more angular surfaces. Jerry was now officially more than a little bit intrigued as to what lay inside this cavern. Standing, he added the nuggets to a plastic sample bag, then placed them almost reverentially into his backpack. He adjusted the shoulder straps of the pack and prepared to enter the steaming black underworld in the rock face before him. Suddenly, Jerry's mind registered what his eyes picked up only moments before. The trees in the surrounding forest were casting lengthening shadows. Time had gotten away from him while he'd been examining this golden aquifer, and the sun was now almost kissing the rim of the glacier. The remaining daylight was growing short. Above, the first probing tendrils of ice fog began cascading off the ancient ice toward him. "Looks like I've overstayed my welcome." He turned to face the cavern's entrance, saying, "You'll have to wait until tomorrow to get your turn." Several small rocks tumbled off the rock wall near the opening, as if to show it was paying attention to Jerry's promise. They bounced along the narrow ledge leading up to the cavern's entrance for a moment before tumbling with a splash into the sizzling stream below. In spite of his precautions, he'd been caught off guard by the rapid movement of the fog, and soon found himself enveloped in a swirling gray cloud. Carefully turning the snowmobile around, he sat in the icy mist a moment longer and pulled out his GPS unit. With a couple of quick button presses, he tagged the precise location of the cavern in the device's memory. He smiled, knowing he could relax this evening with the boys, his GPS receiver assuring him he would have an easy trip back in the morning to explore the inside of this potentially valuable new find. Jerry yawned again and smiled sadly as he looked over toward Tyler. The man was now slumped sideways in his chair, temporarily unconscious due to the many trips to the watering trough over the last few hours. A small drift of aluminum beer cans was piled high next to Ty's chair, a silent testament to his powerful thirst so far this evening. Over the years, Tyler had fancied himself as the de facto leader of the group, and when they were out on one of their yearly Four Bros adventures, it seemed inevitable that he would make sure there was plenty of alcohol available. He constantly monitored everyone around him, making sure they were as well lubricated as he was, and if they weren't, he'd keep pestering them and pushing the booze on them until they were. This year, Jerry's other college brother, Nick, had decided to buy a Texas Mickey-sized 3-liter bottle of Jack Daniels. It was the kind that came with a handle to help you steady the big jug on your shoulder, just like Granny did on the Beverly Hillbillies, while you sloshed some of Tennessee's finest Old No. 7 down your parched throat. Usually, Jerry knew Nick only brought along a 40-pounder, but this year he decided to supersize it for some reason, most likely at Tyler's behest. Jerry closed his eyes for a moment, but every time he did, visions of dollar signs danced behind his eyelids as he envisioned the golden nuggets he'd found. That was the other reason he wasn't drinking tonight. He didn't want to get smashed and then have to get up early tomorrow morning with a throbbing head and try to navigate the treacherous, ice-slicked path back to the cavern on his high-pitched, droning wasp-mobile. Just the thought of spelunking around a cavern half-tanked was scary enough, but when you threw in the fact that it could easily have dormant lava tubes scattered throughout, some of them possibly dropping thousands of meters into the darkness below, it was just insane. No, stumbling drunkenly into one of those black holes was not an appealing idea. He knew he'd have to add the concept to the ever-growing list that comprised the bulk of his pet project, a book he planned on self-publishing later in the year called Darwin's Herd Thinners, working title only. Falling into a seemingly bottomless pit while inebriated would have to be at least death number 235, according to his calculations. He'd have to check his notes to verify it when he finally got back near a cell tower and was able to access the cloud-saved data on his cell phone once more. Jerry loathed taking notes on his iPhone when his $4,000 laptop was just sitting at home, keeping warm and dry. But he wasn't about to expose his MacBook Pro to the foggy, icy air he'd seen floating around Lawless recently, so home is where it was going to stay, and he knew he'd just have to suck it up. The last thing he needed was Tyler trying to play World of Warcraft on his laptop in the middle of sub-zero temperatures and have him bork his computer because of some condensation issue shorting out the motherboard. The smoke and fog parted momentarily, and Jerry saw Nick sitting across the roaring fire, looking a little green around the gills. Nick wobbled back and forth in his chair for a moment, then looked down in disgust at something in his lap, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Jerry worried that when he wasn't paying attention to Nick at some point, perhaps during a moment of limited visibility due to the smoke and fog, his friend might choose that time to ooze off of his camp chair and roll into the blazing bonfire like a large, drunken log. If something so unfortunate came to pass, he figured it would be death number 236 for his new book. Nick had been doing his wobbling routine next to the flames for the last half hour now. So far, every time he'd wobbled, he'd wake up just enough to stabilize himself, then take another gulp of beer from the can jammed between his thick legs, and also maybe a chug of bourbon if the bottle of Jack were nearby. After a few minutes, his buddy would begin to doze off again, wavering back and forth in his seat near the fire as he swam in and out of consciousness, threatening to immolate himself accidentally once more. Mostly with Tyler's help and a half-dozen or so of the aforementioned beers, Nick had downed almost a third of the bottle of whiskey over the last couple of hours. Now, when he wasn't perched precariously on the precipice of passing out, he was constantly getting up and staggering through the shortcut that led to the forest behind his chair. Each time he disappeared, he'd invariably hollered out that he was unrenting some more beer. When Nick was coherent and sober, he usually said, almost sagely, "You can never truly buy beer. You can only rent it." Looking across the fire at Nick, It appeared to Jerry that some of the beer and whiskey might have come back out the wrong end of Nick and found their way onto his lap. He shouted over the colossal blaze to Nick, "You doing okay, buddy? It looks like you're having some issues." Nick's head snapped up. He looked through the smoke and haze for a moment at Jerry with bleary eyes, as if considering an answer, then leaned forward and puked into the campfire. It hissed and sputtered as the vomit vaporized in its searing heat, as if Nick's stomach spew was an affront to its blazing dignity. From his vantage point at the head of the fire, Tyler saw this latest occurrence and hooted with delight, tossing another can of beer toward Nick, saying, "Glad to see you made more room, brother. Here's another." With red-rimmed eyes, Nick watched the beer roll through the brown-colored slush. It came to rest against the side of the air mattress of Jerry's other college brother, Matt. Already sound asleep, Matt was stretched out on top of his air mattress near the campfire, basking in its warmth. He'd taken several hits off of Nick's bottle of JD, in addition to a couple of the special medicinal cigarettes he'd also brought along. Jerry glanced at his watch and saw that it had been at least 15 minutes since his friend had last been vertically oriented. With his purple toque pulled down over his eyes, Matt was using his backpack as a pillow. His long, dark, dreadlocked hair spilled out over the pack's sides like a dead octopus on a rock. To aid in their camping experience, when the Bro Squad, Tyler's idea, had first arrived at the clearing that afternoon, they'd driven the snowmobiles back and forth across the clearing several times. Ty's plan was to flatten down the snow so that they would have a relatively level spot in which to camp and not have to slog back and forth as they traversed the site. When they were done, Ty told them to make sure they all backed their sleds in so that they were all facing skis out and ready to go for the next day's activities. That way, they'd be able to blast out into the snow in the morning without wasting any of their valuable time jockeying them around. Jerry yawned and glanced over his shoulder with longing toward the tent where his sleeping bag lay, but couldn't see it through the heavy fog. They'd erected the 6-man structure at the back side of the clearing, safely away from the bonfire's shooting embers, next to where they'd parked the snowmobiles. At Tyler's back, the trail the 4 sleds made on their way into camp that afternoon disappeared and reappeared like a mirage, occasionally obscured by the smoke and fog that rose in serpentine coils into the night air. Wide and spacious, the trail was almost like a road in the snow, easily marking their progress into the center of the clearing. Off to Jerry's right, through the undulating mist, he caught the occasional glimpse of his own single snowmobile trail coming in from the direction of the forest that backed onto the campfire. Trying to get comfortable, Jerry felt something lumpy digging into his side. He reached into the large outer pocket of his jacket and probed around for a moment, then pulled out his GPS receiver. Surprised to see that he'd left it on, he checked the battery level indicator and was relieved to see its charge still appeared to be almost full. He turned the unit over in his hands, marveling at the technology. Though he had GPS on his cell phone, it wasn't the same as this device. His cell phone used assisted GPS, not true GPS like the unit he was holding. At any given time, this GPS receiver linked directly to a minimum of 4 global positioning satellites circling the planet. His cell phone, on the other hand, relied on cellular repeater towers to assist its location tracking capabilities with no direct link to any satellites. Out here, without a single cell tower in sight, the phone now acted as nothing more than a glorified camera, alarm clock, and flashlight combination. If something happened to one of them while they were out here, in the middle of nowhere, they were on their own. Jerry jumped as another bubble of sap in the green wood exploded with a pop, sending more embers churning high into the shifting fog. He was happy to see that he was now far enough away to no longer be a target of flying cinders, but still close enough to feel the warmth of the fire. He turned off the GPS unit to conserve its battery and placed it back in his jacket pocket. Leaning over, Jerry reached down and grabbed the beer in the snow next to his chair. He took a small sip and watched the wandering fog rolling in waves out of the darkness toward him. It washed over him and merged with the billowing smoke from the green wood burning on the fire, making him cough. Looking around the camp with somewhat watery eyes, he saw that, apart from the circular oasis of light and warmth that the bonfire provided, the rest of the camp now lay encrusted under a glistening white frost of ice. Jerry placed the almost full beer back into its snowy cup holder. Thanks to his current lack of interest in pounding back the booze like the rest of the bros, when he'd informed them of his new, healthier lifestyle, they had enthusiastically nominated him as the designated driver for the trip before they'd even left Vancouver. Jerry had no problem with that. On the drive up from the coast, they'd encountered a little bit of thick, patchy, low cloud on a couple of the mountain passes, as well as some compact snow and slushy roads. It was nothing too concerning, as Tyler's massive Dodge Ram 3500 pickup was a four-wheel drive. Still, Jerry was glad the roads had been good. He wasn't a huge fan of driving through inclement weather in a monster truck loaded with loud, sloppy drunks, so that had been a relief. But it had been a long trip. The drinking and rowdiness had started almost as soon as they'd left. Tyler had brought along a flask to share with Nick and Matt, getting them pre-lubed for the party like he was. When they stopped that afternoon at the Osoyos Holiday Inn, Jerry had felt relieved to be out of the pickup truck and the eye-watering whiskey fumes that filled the cab. Almost before the truck stopped, Tyler and the boys were stumbling out the door and heading to the hotel bar for a few dozen more drinks and an evening of partying. Of course, trying to get everyone awake and moving before 5 o'clock the next morning had been quite a challenge. But thanks to the 3 large double-doubles from the local Tim Hortons, he'd managed to pour the boys back into Tyler's Dodge and had them underway again before sunup. After several hours of following scenic Provincial Highway 3, Jerry turned off onto Highway 3C and headed north toward the Kootenay Glacier and Lawless. Just after 9 o'clock, they crested the apex of the Golden Mile Pass. Taking a break, Jerry pulled off of the highway onto the adjacent viewpoint overlooking the valley. The view was breathtaking. Snow-covered mountain peaks jutted like broken teeth through the dense fog that filled the valley bottom, a blanket of gray that smothered the city of Lawless below. Sitting majestically in the distance at the back of the valley, the Kootenay Glacier poked its head through the clouds, its ancient ice shining a brilliant white as it bathed in the morning sunshine. Continuing their journey, they descended into the gray twilight toward Lawless, heading for the sporting goods outlet where they'd reserved their snowmobiles. After a few wrong turns in the fog, they arrived at an aging aluminum Quonset hut on the outskirts of town. As they finished up the rental paperwork, the tall, bald-headed proprietor behind the counter asked Tyler, "Did you boys come prepared?" With amusement, Jerry watched Tyler, who had been at the cash register preparing to pay. Ty greeted the man's question with a blank expression, as if he were wondering whether the guy behind the till was also trying to sell him a pack of prophylactics or something. But then the shopkeeper had continued and clarified things by saying, "Despite the many standout geographical features of Lawless and the lovely Kootenay Glacier area, using any of them to navigate in the middle of winter around here is about as helpful as a driver's license to a blind man, thanks to all this goddamned fog." Tyler continued to stare at the man. "So I'd recommend you carry, at the minimum, at least one other GPS unit for redundancy's sake, in case something happens to your friends there," the proprietor finished, looking over at Jerry, who had been fiddling around with his own GPS unit while he waited. Caught off guard, Jerry took a second and then agreed, explaining to Ty that his cell phone-based GPS was crap out in the backcountry and that he'd better listen to the man. Tyler stared at the shopkeeper and then Jerry with the same blank expression for several more seconds, as if deciding whether they were bullshitting him or not, or perhaps thankful that he hadn't said the first thing that had popped into his head about the pack of condoms. He sighed, as if relieved, saying, "All right, add one on to the bill." The smiling shopkeeper said, "A wise decision, my friend." He turned and looked at the small inventory of shrink-wrapped GPS receivers hanging on the wall behind him and grabbed the top unit, which, from what Jerry could see, was also the most expensive one. Ringing up the total on the till, the proprietor said, "These things sell like hotcakes every winter when the fog hits. You're really lucky you came when you did, since I just got more of these units back in stock last week." Looking rather unimpressed with his good fortune, Tyler briefly glanced out the foggy window toward the last stop they would be making before heading up into the mountains for their vacation. Barely visible across the street, a tall blue lotto sign revolved atop a black and white marquee advertising a small, squat, cinder-block convenience store next to it. The flickering letters proclaimed the Gas and Gulp to be the proud purveyor of liquor, lotto, and groceries. Tyler was no doubt already checking off items on his mental shopping list once they got across the road to the convenience store. Jerry looked through the window himself, thinking without a shadow of a doubt that when Tyler checked out at the convenience store, there would be plenty of the first two advertised items in his basket and very little of the third. Tyler turned his attention back to the shopkeeper and said, "Gee, thanks. Seeing as I'm that lucky, maybe I'd better pick up a couple of 649 tickets across the street." The shopkeeper said nothing and only grinned, ringing up an impressively high total on the cash register's LCD screen. Smiling lightly as he recalled their morning at the rental shop, Jerry reached down and grabbed his beer in the snow once more, taking another small sip. He grimaced from the Lucky Lager's slight aftertaste and placed the can back on the ground. A twinge in his lower back reminded him how stiff he currently was from the long drive over the last couple of days, and he was paying for it now. Thinking of the day ahead of him tomorrow, he started making mental notes of things to check the next day. His eyeball-searingly yellow snowmobile was at the top of the list. If there were any mechanical problems with the machine, he didn't want to be in a situation where he'd be snowshoeing it back to camp. Number 1, he didn't have any snowshoes, and number 2, the snow was quite deep, easily up to his waist and over his head in some places. GPS unit or not, he'd be slogging through kilometers of this clammy crap if something happened, and that was definitely not on his list of fun things to do on vacation. Looking to his left, Jerry saw that Tyler was nodding in and out of consciousness as well now. Sprawled in his camp chair, Ty's legs stuck out, his head nodding forward onto his chest. Every few seconds his head would snap up and his eyes would fly open. After a brief, myopic glance around the camp, he would gradually close them once more as his chin slowly sank back down onto his chest. Though he'd moved farther back from the bonfire that the boys had built, thanks to the comforting warmth of the blaze, Jerry felt like he too might just fall asleep if he weren't careful. He stifled a yawn. This wasn't where he wanted to sleep tonight. No, he'd rather be in the warm, cozy confines of his sleeping bag, which just recently began calling to him with its siren song of sleep. Jerry's eyelids began to droop, on the edge of nodding off himself, when he heard what sounded like someone struggling, quickly followed by the rustling of dry brush. His eyes snapped back open, and he looked across to where Nick had been doing his wobbling act moments before. A brief gap opened in the swirling smoke over the fire. Nick's camp chair was laying on its side in the snow, with Nick nowhere in sight. "Nick!" Jerry called, thinking that his friend may have finally succumbed to alcohol and gravity and tumbled into the campfire. Shit. Jerry jumped up from his canvas chair and stood to see if Nick's smoldering body lay in the muddy slush next to the fire. But the fog and smoke had stopped cooperating. He couldn't see anything through the haze. Moving quickly, Jerry rounded the fire, calling out, "Nick! Where are you, brother? Are you okay?" Next to Nick's overturned camp chair, the bottle of J.D. lay on its side in a small pool of its golden contents, most of which had already disappeared into the slushy mud. Only a few drops of the tan fluid from Tennessee remained in the jug now. Jerry righted the bottle, saying, "That's going to put a damper on the party." Standing, he called out to the forest, "Nick, what's going on, big fella? Did the jack catch up with you finally?" The thick brush behind the campfire remained mute to his inquiry. Sighing, Jerry decided to give Nick a few more seconds, just in case he was puking, or maybe back there playing with his bait and tackle in the dark. In the meantime, he would walk over to Tyler, give him a good swift kick, and tell him it was time to pack it in for the night. As he turned, another rustling noise came from the bushes at his back, followed by what sounded like muffled screams of pain. Jerry moved toward the gap in the brush that led to the forest beyond. The gray mist seemed to thicken as he approached, as if trying to foil his investigation. "Nick, what in the hell are you doing, man? Are you trying to scare me? 'Cause it's not work."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?